In the 1820s and 1830s, Carlisle was making national and even international headlines, but for all the wrong reasons. "We wonder what the rest of the kingdom must think of us," asked the Carlisle Patriot newspaper in June 1826. "We feature in all the journals of empire, nay, in the French journals likewise, as the perfect example of this savage turbulence in His Majesty's goodly island of Great Britain." But what was this savage turbulence of which the paper spoke, and where did it come from? The simple answer seemed to be that it came from the city's Shaddongate area, a district that had rapidly grown with Carlisle's industrialisation from the early 19th century onwards. In 1826 and again in 1830, unrest in Shaddongate had led to rioting and violence, resulting in several deaths and many more serious injuries. With its factories and textile mills, most notably Shaddon Mill, at one point the largest in England, Shaddongate was the embodiment of New Carlisle, yet the new does not always sit comfortably alongside the old. For centuries, the old medieval walls, of which this western section is the only surviving remnant, had marked the boundaries of the city. In its medieval heyday, Carlisle had been an important administrative and military centre due to its proximity to the Anglo-Scottish border. But with the union of the English and Scottish crowns in 1707, it seemed that the once great border city was destined for a slow decline into relative insignificance. That was all to change, however, with the coming of the Industrial Revolution. Improved transport links and the spread of new technology helped Carlisle to expand into a major industrial centre, and in 1813, in what would now be regarded as an act of wanton vandalism, the medieval walls were demolished in order to allow the city to grow. The city's population had grown rapidly to meet the needs of the new industries. In 1763, it had been around 4,000, but by 1841 it was pushing 20,000. The newcomers were largely Irish and Scottish immigrants, and their arrival massively altered the demographics of the city. A survey of 1831 revealed that out of 7,000 adult males over the age of 20 living in the city, nearly 2,000 had been born in Ireland, while another 1,000 were of Scottish origin. Though these immigrants were vital to industrial output, they were regarded with suspicion and at times outright hostility by the city's social and political elites. When unrest broke out, the authorities placed the blame squarely on the Shaddongaters, attributing the violence to the inherent criminality of the immigrant population. Carlisle was described by one observer as a second Ireland. Another paper was accused of referring to the city's Irish weavers as a depraved and abandoned gang of lawless villains. The city's elites felt threatened by the incomers, and, as the rioting was to show, they were powerless in the face of the mob, having to rely on military assistance to subdue the agitation. It was this fear that led to the establishment of a police force in Carlisle in 1827, headed by the Mancunian Benjamin Batty. With this force, the city's governors hoped to restore control across the city and bring the troublesome inhabitants of Shaddongate to heel. For Carlisle's ruling elite, then, Shaddongate was a hotbed of unrest, and its inhabitants a motley crew of troublemakers and criminals. But if we view things from the perspective of the Shaddongaters, a rather different picture begins to emerge. Low wages, cramped and filthy living conditions, often with several families occupying a single room, made life hard for the area's working class inhabitants, and the regular outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhus fueled an alarming mortality rate, especially among children. Yet while this was a matter of concern to some middle-class onlookers who sought to alleviate the squalid and unhealthy living conditions of the Shaddongaters, many more watched on with indifference, or even blamed the workers themselves for the filth in which they lived. One such observer, writing about the appalling state of toilet facilities in the cities, claimed that some individuals really seem to have a pleasure in dirtying them, and when the place gets filthy, they use the outside, or even the footpaths of the streets. Sadly, this kind of condescending attitude towards the people of Shaddongate was not uncommon, even among those who sought to improve the conditions of the working classes. Carlisle was a city strongly divided along social lines, and Shaddongate, with its mills and factories and predominantly working class immigrant population, was a very different place to Old Carlisle, the heart of which lay within the boundaries of the old city walls. The town hall and the castle represented the civic and military power of the ruling establishment, yet Shaddongate, the free city, only a few hundred yards beyond the old city boundaries, was seen as something of a no-go zone for the local elite. When Benjamin Batty, head of Carlisle's new police force, attempted to visit Shaddongate in 1827, he was pelted with stones,
and forced to hide from a mob several hundred strong before he was rescued by soldiers dispatched from the castle.
While Batty no doubt saw this as another reflection of the area's inherent criminality, there were very good reasons why the forces of law and order might be treated with suspicion and hostility in Shaddongate. The previous year had seen rioting, which was eventually put down by the military with the loss of 3 lives, while the staunchly Tory Carlisle Patriot newspaper argued that it was the unruly inhabitants of Shaddongate who were responsible for the deaths, claiming that the blood of the sufferers is on the heads of the originators of the riot and not those who quelled it. The true cause of the violence was rather more complex. 1826 was a general election year, and as part of the election campaign, the Tory candidate, Sir Philip Musgrave, went to Shaddongate in order to canvass support. From a 21st century perspective, this might not seem unusual, but the universal suffrage we enjoy today was a long way off in 1826. Voting rights were restricted to a very select group of adult males. Only 5% of the city's population over the age of 20 actually had a vote, and you could probably count the number of eligible voters in Shaddongate on your fingers. In this light, and bearing in mind the poverty and squalor in which many Shaddongaters were living, a far cry from the luxuries available to Sir Philip and the city's elite, his decision to enter the district seems foolhardy at best, and at worst, downright dangerous. Certainly, it was provocative, and served as a painful reminder that most of the people in Shaddongate lacked a political voice. Soon after entering the area, Sir Philip was accosted by a group of residents who began to robustly question him about the policies of his government, which had done so much to impoverish them and to continue to deny them a part in politics. Evidently his answers were unsatisfactory, and soon a large mob gathered, throwing stones at Sir Philip and his party, who were held as virtual hostages until soldiers from the castle came to his rescue. But in the face of the mob, the inexperienced and undisciplined lads of the 55th Regiment of Foot opened fire, leading to the deaths of 3 innocent bystanders. The tragic outcome of the rioting caused outrage in Shaddongate, and indeed across the city as a whole. When election day dawned, a huge crowd of Shaddongaters, who of course were unable to vote, descended upon the town hall, and violence ensued as the crowd tried to fight their way inside. The mayor was evacuated with some difficulty after having been shouted at, spat on and roughed up. Some of the crowd were even calling for him to be hanged. This was the savage turbulence which the Carlisle Patriot had referred to. But while physical attacks on public officials are hardly to be condoned, the disorder in Shaddongate and its overspill into the city centre appear to be much more than the actions of a gang of criminals, as the Patriot and its readers seem to think. The Shaddongaters had legitimate grievances. Marginalised, excluded from the political franchise and living in poverty, they had every reason to be angry. What they lacked was a constructive means of expressing their anger, and the civic elite made sure that this continued to be the case. Indeed, the pillars of the establishment lived in fear of the radicalisation of the proletariat and sought to undermine the growing political consciousness of the Shaddongaters at every opportunity. When rioting broke out again in 1830, it transpired that the instigators were actually police agents working for Constable Batty. The authorities had hoped to provoke violence in order to provide a pretext for crushing any radical sentiment in Shaddongate, but the scale of the disorder soon spiralled out of control. Batty and his men had clearly underestimated just how politically radical the inhabitants of Shaddongate were. Amongst the Shaddongaters, then, we can see the emergence of a genuine political consciousness and a desire to make their concerns known, however questionable the means of doing so, rather than remain passive in the face of injustice and inequality. Neither were they alone. Across the country, the oppressed classes continued to agitate, and though it took a long time, eventually rights which we take for granted, such as voting or trial by jury, became available to all. Of course, many other injustices still remain in society, but it's important to remember that Shaddongate had a part to play, however small, in the greater struggle for workers' rights. In fact, its importance is much greater than that. Shaddongate's people and industries have shaped Carlisle as we know it today. Carlisle entered the 20th century as a city of industry and commerce, not a border outpost, and Shaddongate and its people lay at the heart of this transformation.